Je suis très heureux de vous accueillir ce midi au nom de la professeure Angela Cameron, qui est la chaire Greenberg, et de moi-même pour cet événement conjoint de la chaire Shirley Greenberg pour les femmes et la profession juridique à la faculté de droit, et donc le centre de recherche en droit, technologie et société de l'université d'Ottawa. Professors Cameron and Gilbert, who have been behind this panel, are sadly unable to join us today. This is why I am the one presenting today, and send their regrets. So today we're welcoming three amazing, I'm a big fan of their work, three amazing emergent feminist scholars who will present a snapshot of their current research and reflection on feminist responses to take, facilitated, and gendered violence. We will start with Dillon Black, a PhD student in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. Their research agenda hopes to interrogate the intersection of privacy, gender-based violence, and surveillance technologies. A recognized feminist advocate with the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women, Dillon has been named as one of the top 100 most influential people in global policy on gender equality. And lately, Prime Minister Trudeau appointed them to the Gender Equality Advisory Council for Canada's G7 presidency. You will then hear from Suzie Dunn, a part-time professor in the Faculty of Law, and a PhD in law student and an equality fellow at the Center. Her research focuses on technology-facilitated violence against women. She's the co-chair of the Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action. She has also been involved in public policy, notably working with Global Affairs Canada in drafting and securing a resolution with the Human Rights Committee at the UN on violence against women and girls in a digital context. And finally, but not the least, we will listen to Anastasia Berwald, a PhD student in law at this center again. Anastasia research focuses on content moderation and social media, notably through a feminist lens. She has been researching the interface of law and technology under both common law and civil law for quite a while now at McGill University at Université de Montréal, and has done research for the National Association of Women and the Law. Each of them will speak for like around 50 minutes, and then we will have like a Q&A session with the audience. And so now I'm going to start to speak, and without further ado, I will hand it over to Dillon. Thank you very much.
Merci, Florian. Good morning. It's fun to be here at lunch. I mean, there's snacks, so at least there's snacks, right? Before I start, I usually like to kind of just situate the context in which we're talking about these things. So I believe it's important to acknowledge that we're currently on unceded Algonquin territory. I've been doing a lot of my work in my scholarship in the context of these lands, and particularly when we're talking about gender-based violence and violence against women, it is especially important to talk about these because of the issues around consent and colonialism, and just recognizing that that is part of the history, and we can't talk about these issues without really situating it within that context. So that's really important. And then also, I just want to give people a heads up that, around a content warning. Not that I feel like I could really police what people's triggers are, but I think it's important for you folks to know that some of the things we might talk about might be a little bit more difficult. So if you feel like you need to go to the washroom or get more snacks or do things to take care of yourself, totally feel free to do that. So my name is Dillon, and I am currently less than 1 kilometer away from you. Yeah, I thought that was funny because, dating apps and stuff. But anyways, I'm also just really awkward. Anyways, so I I came to this work, and particularly anti-violence work, as a method of healing and belonging, and as a queer and gender non-conforming person who is also a survivor of sexual violence, it has really been hard for me to see myself reflected in anything. So for me, part of doing this work is always trying to model and strive for that. As a marginalized person, this work, research, academia, is personal and political, so finding ways to try to model that is especially critical. And I think within the context of Me Too and everything kind of going on in the world, the hashtag dumpster fire really comes to my mind. I've been using that a lot lately, especially what's been going on, on the news and that kind of stuff. But I think, conversations around sexual and gender-based violence, transparency, accountability are being dragged to the forefront. So it is more important than ever that we need to be tackling these issues in our digital and online spaces as much as we are tackling them in real life. But I mean, a lot of us would argue that they're very, very much intertwined. So what I'm going to talk to you about here today is going to be a mix of my experience working in the community, as well as some of the insights I've gained in studying these issues, but more importantly, the convergence of these two, and maybe spaces where we need to talk about the convergence a little bit more. So through a mix of circumstance and urgency, I was thrown into dealing with technology-facilitated violence and the ways in which these emerging issues were impacting the lives of women, LGBTQ people, people living with disabilities, and other marginalized communities, but especially young people. And that was obviously a really tall order. So the thing was, not only were we starting to experience the devastating impacts and consequences of technology-facilitated violence, we were actually incredibly unprepared and had no resources in really dealing with it. So as you have heard, I work with the Ottawa Coalition to End Violence Against Women. We're a local organization here made up of 40 different organizations, and some of our members include places like domestic violence shelters, sexual assault support centers, the Ottawa Hospital, and just basically a lot of folks who are on the ground dealing with issues of sexual violence and gender-based violence. But somehow the issue of technology a few years ago was actually becoming a really, really important and emerging issue. And then for some reason, I just kind of got thrown into that and became one of the only people on the East Coast here in Canada really working on these issues on the ground. So before I could really understand the implications of technology, I spent some time listening to what frontline service people were telling me. And I think, when we're talking about academia and scholarship, I think it's really important to connect those points back to actually what people are experiencing on the ground and also how organizations are dealing with it. So we knew that survivors were coming to them with experiences unlike any other that we had ever seen before. Service providers and technology organizations we're using didn't come close to what was needed in reality. So, as you can probably imagine, violence against women organizations aren't super well funded. So a lot of our technology is unfortunately still from the 1990s. So trying to deal with some of the emerging issues in technology is actually really, really hard. And especially service providers like shelters and sexual assault support centers were definitely not equipped properly to deal with some of the issues that were happening. Violence against women counselors especially were coming to me and telling me how they were at their wits' end and were actually making women leave their technologies outside of their counseling sessions, so women couldn't bring their phones inside. I had some situations where shelter staff were actually telling me that because of the issues with technology facilitated violence like stalking and perpetrators finding out locations of shelters, they were actually asking women to break their phones. So, to ask people to break their phones and thinking that breaking a phone is actually the best way in dealing with technology-facilitated violence obviously is a huge problem, not only because, women who are experiencing violence don't have a lot of resources, so a thing like a phone is really important, but also it kind of just goes to show that we see technology in a lot of ways as really problematic, and we don't really understand the ways in which maybe technology can be used to respond to violence, right, or to survive violence. So I think those are kind of some of the questions that we were dealing with on the ground. And also, it was becoming harder and harder to maintain records and evidence of abuse and stalking. We're seeing a lot of increasing use of subpoenas to try to collect the information that these organizations have. So, for example, the Ottawa Rape Crisis Center actually has a policy of, no questions, no data, no notes. So they actually don't take any notes because of this huge issue, which is a huge problem. And last but certainly not least, for those women who felt safe enough to report issues of technology-facilitated violence to the police, They were either laughed at. I've heard stories where they told they were crazy, they had mental health issues, and also the police literally do not have enough resources to properly investigate situations of violence. They would complain that it takes hours and hours to rip apart someone's car to try to find if it's been wiretapped, or looking at surveillance technologies in houses and that kind of stuff. So it's not that technology was necessarily creating more violence. It just actually creates a lot of barriers and complexities around how do we deal with violence. So I'm not saying that technology is the cause of violence, but it's been being used in really creative ways to actually perpetrate that kind of violence. So preventing it and trying to react to it is actually making it a lot more complicated, and sitting down with women who are experiencing violence and trying to come up with safety plans and that kind of stuff is actually really, really difficult. So more than that, though, a lot of people aren't seeing the intersectional nature of technology-facilitated violence. Most of the discourses you hear with technology-facilitated violence is oftentimes cyberbullying, and when you talk to young people, they're like completely done with the whole narrative around cyberbullying. They say, it doesn't speak to us, it's kind of overused and it's outdated. So for them, and it wasn't actually speaking to their real experiences. And oftentimes it is young women, it is LGBTQ people, it is racialized people, Indigenous people that are experiencing these issues. So over the last few years, the work championed by feminist activists and gender-based balance activists have come to conceptualize different ways of talking about and thinking about technology-facilitated violence. And I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of my spiel, but then also Suzie and Anastasia are going to talk to you some more about other really awesome stuff. So some of the issues we're seeing is things like online harassment and hate speech, digital dating abuse. You can easily go on the Google store and you can download an application called Girlfriend Stalker. So the fact that Google and Apple and all these kinds of companies are allowing these sorts of applications to exist or to be sold on their platforms is really problematic. And also, there's also a non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which I think we'll talk a little bit more in depth later on. Recording and sharing of sexual violence. So where people are going to parties or concerts or festivals, we're seeing this a lot of the time, and people are being sexually assaulted and then they record it and then post it online. Exploitation, trolling, doxing. Doxing, if you don't know what that is, it is when someone's information is taken and then posted online. So for example, I have a friend who's a feminist blogger in Toronto, and she often speaks really explicitly about feminist activism and just talking about issues that women face. And because of that, she was targeted by a lot of men's rights activists, and they went and found her information online, and they started posting it in all these Reddit and other kind of subreddits to try to get people to attack her. But they also found out where she lived, where her son went to school, threatening to kill her, that kind of stuff. So that would kind of follow in that, forced outing of LGBTQ people, phishing, luring, and we can probably go on and on about all the different issues. So once people started realizing that, we were finally starting to talk about and think about issues of tech-facilitated violence, service providers, myself, we were being bombarded with a lot of survivors' experiences in unprecedented ways. So, for example, I once went to work and there was a woman sitting in my office, and I didn't know who she was, and she couldn't access technology, she didn't have a phone, but she was telling me this really complex story about how she was literally being stalked from the UK to Australia to Canada, and she came to me with like a file of probably this much paper of all the evidence and recording of what was happening to her. Men were showing up with video cameras, and and when she went to tell the police, they actually just told her she was crazy, and they were interfering with her phone and her technology to the point where she actually hasn't had a phone or any kind of technology for 2 years, and she's at her wit's end and doesn't know what to do. In high conflict custody cases, we're seeing the use of technology to perpetrate domestic violence. So for example, perpetrators install cameras and digital recording devices into gifts given to children. So for example, a lot of gifts like teddy bears might have video cameras or online recording software inside of them, and they're given to children to pass on into their home in order to stalk and monitor the ex-partner or the woman. So that's a huge problem. In Montreal, there was a case where women were being targeted by a group within this kind of dark net situation. And it's weird because when I talk about these things, people are like, that sounds really out of this world, that doesn't sound real, but like actually these are things that we're definitely seeing. And then this case, it was actually an online game where men were part of this group, and it was a point system, so depending on what kind of activities they would do, things like sexually assaulting someone, bringing them home with multiple people, that kind of stuff, they would assign different points, and then the more points you got, then you would win this game. But the whole point of the game was to perpetrate different types of violence and then post it online within this group. So, and then I think for me, one of the biggest thing, you know, and obviously like I have a lot of women coming to me asking me how to get their content taken off online. Suzie, you'll probably talk a bit more about this. You know, websites like The Dirty, which are just meant as kind of a revenge or a place to shame and publicly humiliate women in order to get back at them and that kind of stuff. So these are just a lot of the issues that we're seeing. And for me, it wasn't until the aftermath of a 20-month-long investigation about how police in Canada are addressing sexual assault complaints that I even thought about the importance of things like tech and privacy and gender-based violence and their connections to power. So a big reason that I wanted to start a PhD was because of the way our expertise and knowledge as frontline anti-violence workers are often constantly dismissed as unbiased, as anecdotal, as, you know, not necessarily real or evidence-based, when I was literally seeing all of these issues happening to these women and literally nobody was doing anything about it. So when I was working, you know, in trying to uncover issues, systemic issues in sexual assault investigations, one of the things that happened was the Globe and Mail actually went and they did a access to freedom of information request to multiple police services across Canada. I think they sent out about 250 FTIP requests to try to figure out how they were talking about this particular issue that we were dealing with. And then one of the things is that the police were coming back and saying things like, oh, you know, you can't have access to our information, you can't have access to these cases, you can't have our statistics, because they were trying to protect the privacy of survivors. And I thought that that was really interesting, that they were using a concept like privacy to actually obscure accountability and responsibility in the ways that they were problematically investigating these cases. So that's kind of what made me angry, and I think being angry is a really good reason to start a PhD. And yeah, and so I decided that I really wanted to look at these things. So, I mean, my research isn't necessarily on technology-facilitated violence, but I'm really interested in surveillance and surveillance technologies, the area of big data, and how data and data transparency are actually linked to relations of power, and how this new world that we live in, technology and data and metadata and all these kinds of different pieces, how they're actually being used to collect information about people, to categorize people into, you know, problem populations and to monitor them. So for example, in the United States, we're seeing a lot of issues where, for example, people who are on state-sponsored programs, they're being kind of targeted and monitored and controlled in particular ways. So for example, children's aid societies in the US are starting to use predictive algorithms to try to figure out whether or not women are basically good mothers, or if children should be taken away from their parents. So questions that I want to ask is, you know, should we really be relying on technology to make these decisions that are super complicated and are complex social processes and that kind of stuff? I was in Denmark over the summer. They were talking about things like effective artificial intelligence. So this is, you know, new types of artificial intelligence that is able to read people's emotions, and then they're using that in different ways. So they've started using it in marketing a lot of the time. So in London, there's a lot of advertisements installed on, you know, on the streets, and people are going and they're looking at these advertisements, but it's actually what it's doing is it's reading your emotions and you don't even know. And people would be like, okay, well, you know, that's not like a really huge problem, but actually now they're starting to use these technologies in things like immigration and deportation cases, in law depositions and that kind of stuff. So, and I think the way that we ascribe, you know, these technologies onto humans is really problematic, and we could talk probably a little bit more about that a little bit later. Or things like, you know, facial recognition software, where it takes your face and actually creates your face into data points, and then these are used in all these different kinds of ways for monitoring, biometric surveillance, airport airport kind of crossings, border control. But the one thing is that because it creates your face into a data point, it actually circumvents privacy legislation because it's not it's no longer considered necessarily your personal information, depending on legislation. But I know in the UK that's a big issue that they're dealing with. So anyways, that's what I'm interested in, and I will stop talking now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dillon, for that. I think Dillon covered a lot of the types of online violence and digital violence that occur, so I think that's really helpful for where my part is going to go. I wanted to start off by thanking the Shirley Greenberg Foundation. They fund feminist research and scholarship in a way that not a lot of other organizations are, and it just allows for spaces like this and really interesting research, and so shout out to them. My research focuses specifically on tech-facilitated violence. I'm very interested in the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. I look a lot at deepfakes, which uses this facial recognition technology to swap faces of women into other videos to make it look like they're doing things that they haven't done. Initially it came out in pornographic videos, so putting women non-consensually into pornographic videos. And also this idea of impersonation online as a way to cause harm to women. And when Professor Cameron invited us to speak to talk about the feminist response to tech-facilitated violence, obviously there's so much that can be done and so much more that needs to be done, but I actually had a lot of inspiration and had a hard time narrowing down exactly what I was going to talk about because there's so much good work that's being done. And so what I thought I'd do is I would just start from the macro level of what's being done and go down to the micro level. So looking at what international movements have happened all the way down to what individuals are doing. And I'll speak a bit about my own personal work and then also some of the work of people who really inspire me. Hopefully this is going to click. So last year, I was fortunate to work for Global Affairs Canada. And I was working for Global Affairs Canada, and we worked on two international commitments. The first one was out of the United Nations, the Human Rights Council. It was a resolution titled Preventing and Responding to Violence Against Women and Girls in Digital Contexts. And we also got a commitment out of the G7 titled the Charlevoix Commitment to End Sexual and Gender-Based Violence, Abuse, Harassment in Digital Contexts. And the work that's done at the international level is so important because number one, it recognizes this is a global issue. Often there's conversations that this is a Western issue, it's an issue for countries that have a lot of technology, but essentially wherever technology exists, this type of violence is occurring. And so having that international recognition is important. These documents lay out some of what the violence actually looks like, and so it helps us create international language that we can all rely on. And then both of the documents have recommendations about what governments can do. So this is beneficial in assisting governments in making decisions about how to manage tech-facilitated violence, but also allows us as advocates and academics and feminists to hold our governments to account, to say we know what we need to be doing, this is what we should be doing, and you've already committed to it. Moving down to the next level, you can intervene the Supreme Court of Canada. I was fortunate to support the legal team with an intervention in a case in April of this year called R.V. Jarvis. And Jarvis was a voyeurism case where a high school teacher had taken a hidden camera and a pen and was taking photos of the cleavage of his high school students. And the issue that got to the Supreme Court of Canada was, do those girls have a reasonable expectation of privacy when they're at school? Because that was one of the elements that you have to meet in the voyeurism case. And both SIPC and Leaf National in our interventions brought a feminist analysis to that question. And so in that way, we're hoping to include a feminist analysis in the way that the courts are making decisions about tech-facilitated violence. There's also been calls for legislation. Most of you will probably be familiar with the cases of Amanda Todd and Rehtaeh Parsons. Those were those two teenage girls, one in BC and one in Nova Scotia, who had their images, sexual images taken without their consent and then shared online without their consent, and ultimately impacted their lives in a way that was so drastic. Both of them died by suicide. And after this happened, there was very little legal remedy for these girls outside of child pornography legislation, which wasn't really the true harm in that issue. And so since then, feminist advocates and anti-violence advocates have been pushing for legislation. So in 2014, we saw the introduction of a criminal code provision that criminalized non-consensual distribution of intimate images. We've seen civil legislation introduced in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and Manitoba. And in Saskatchewan, I thought they took a particularly feminist way of introducing their legislation. They've got a reverse onus. And so what that means is that the person who shared the photo has to prove that they got consent to share it, rather than the burden being on the person who had the photo shared trying to prove that they didn't consent to it. So I thought that was an important change in Saskatchewan. In Nova Scotia and Manitoba, they have agencies, one called CyberScan and the other called the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. And those organizations you can actually call and get supports from. So if you want help getting content taken down, understanding what your legal rights are, those organizations can provide some supports on the ground prior to you deciding to take any sort of legal action. And here in Ontario, of course, we've recently had the tort introduced of the publication of private facts, which brings me to one of the next things that you can do, is you can just be that lawyer. And most of you are law students who will soon be lawyers, and some of the work that you can do to have a feminist response to tech-facilitated violence is just to do the work. And these are some lawyers who have been doing fantastic work. Donna Wilson was a fairly early call and a sole practitioner at the time when she took on the Jane Doe case, which established the tort of the publication of private facts. And so she took that on herself with this woman, Jane Doe, and changed Canadian law in Ontario about how we deal with non-consensual distribution. That case is still ongoing in certain issues, and it's been now taken up by Molly Reynolds, who's a lawyer at Tories, who's doing really fantastic work supporting survivors of non-consensual distribution. And she's recently actually filed a civil case against a pornography website that's challenging the ways that they allow non-consensually distributed images onto their sites and how they take it down. Gillian Natu is another lawyer in Toronto who's doing really interesting work. She recently brought a class action case against the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. There was a photographer that was working for them who allegedly had been pressuring young ballet students to take topless photos and then was sharing those and selling those online without their consent. Hold my water. We'll just ignore that. Thanks for pointing it out. No, and Gillian also was the counsel for Leaf at RV Jarvis and is doing fantastic work. Carrie Goldberg is a lawyer out of the United States. I don't know if any of you have seen her before. She had that fantastic New Yorker piece. And she was actually a victim of non-consensual distribution. And she wasn't finding the support she needed, so she just became that lawyer. And she's had massive wins. In the States, you have larger wins for civil cases. I think some of her clients have got $6.5 million for having their images disclosed. And she's supported teachers who've been fired after their images have been released without their consent. And the slogan of her law firm, I actually think is a bit is feminist, and it says, "Our clients are not fragile like a flower; they're fragile like a bomb," which I really like. So be those lawyers. That's a great feminist response. The next type of work that I think is great feminist response to tech-facilitated violence is doing the research. And Asmina Drogia is a researcher out of Amnesty International. She's Canadian, but she works in the London office in UK. And over the last 2 years, she has done extraordinary qualitative and quantitative research about online harassment that women human rights defenders, feminists, and women politicians experience online. And the importance of this type of research is that we all know what these experiences are. It's like what Dillon was saying, when they're hearing these experiences, we know they're true, but often people challenge us and say, is this really happening? And when you have research like this that Asmina's doing, you then have the numbers behind you to support your arguments and to support the change. And so being able to do feminist research that backs up the experiences that of gender-based violence is extraordinarily important. Academics. I've got a soft spot for them, obviously, being a PhD and having these fabulous other feminist academics around me. These are some academics if you're interested in looking at who is doing a lot of the foundational work. Danielle Citron and Marianne Franks were really pioneers when it came to tech-facilitated violence. They were working on this issue before anyone really realized it was an issue. Hate crimes in cyberspace, I'm sure all of us have cited it in our research, is a foundational piece that was done. Here at our faculty, Professor Jane Bailey has been doing extraordinary work in this. Their collection, E-Girls, Equality, is a fabulous book if you're interested in tech-facilitated violence. Anastasia Powell and Nicola Henry recently produced this book, Sexual Violence in a Digital Age, and it has everything in it. I read that book and I was like, I wanted to write that book for my PhD, but it's already done. So I was a bit disappointed, but it's a great resource. There's a PDF available of it at the library if you want to read it. And then Claire McGlynn and Erica Rackley are also two important feminist scholars. And the reason that I wanted to note them particularly is because they really work on the language that we use on tech-facilitated violence. They step away from this idea of using terms like revenge porn, which are really problematic, suggesting that there's some sort of thing that women have done in order to deserve their photos to be released, and also that their photos can be consumed like pornography, which they shouldn't be consumed like pornography. Claire McGlynn and Erica Rackley call this image-based abuse, and so their scholarship around changing the language of tech-facilitated violence is very important. Getting away from the academics and the lawyers, there's the community-based work. There's the work at Ottawa that's being done here in the United States. The Cyber Civil Rights Initiative was started by Holly Jacobs, who was one of the first survivors that there was a lot of information about. Her sexualized images had been released in association with a faculty that she was doing her PhD at, suggesting that she had released the images on purpose to give to her students. And the harassment that she faced was so severe that she actually had to legally change her name and change her career. And she changed her career to starting the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative and has now done extraordinary work. This organization provides 24-hour counseling. It helps people get harmful content taken down and helps them navigate the legal options that are available to them. The Badass Army is the same. It's a little bit more grassroots, just for victims who weren't finding the support that they needed, and so learned how to get images taken down, learned what their options were, and started pushing governments to create legislation. And again, just started this themselves, learned how to do the work and do it themselves. And so both of those groups, I think, are fantastic, and we should start one of those groups here in Canada if anyone is interested. Yeah, let's do it. Survivors speaking up is very important, and with tech-facilitated violence, it takes an incredible amount of courage to speak up, because often your name is associated with the abusive content that's online. And so making your name public and making yourself public can often bring more traffic to the abusive material that's online. And Noelle Martin, I think, is an extraordinary survivor. She had taken photos of herself before she went to a party. She's an Australian, she was 17 at the time. And those photos got picked up and put on a porn site. And people became so interested in photos of this woman, they started friending her friends so they could mine her social media for images to post on pornography sites, and also doctored those images to make it look as though she was engaging in pornography. And she has been an extraordinary advocate. And in that, she also has recognized that she's brought in further attention to her that has been harmful. But for her, it was worth it because she's helped so many people, and she's also encouraged legislators to change how they think about image-based abuse, and that it's not just the image of your body, but images that are doctored, images that are photoshopped in ways that are harmful can be equally as damaging to a person. And Noelle Martin's advocacy on this and sharing her personal story has been very effective. Art and media, I think often we think about the law and how it's going to protect us, and we need to have laws in place to protect survivors. They deserve that support from our governments and our courts. But really what we want to do is we want to change the culture of how we use technology and what's the best way to use technology. And often the most accessible way to learn about these things is through art and media. Here at the faculty, Joanne St. Louis created a course where one of the assignments is to create an art project that has to do with an area of law that you're interested in. I think it's still showing on the 5th floor at the Human Rights Center, so you should all go see it. It's an excellent exhibit. Netizens is a documentary that was made about tech-facilitated violence and goes through the journey of 4 different women who've experienced different forms of tech-facilitated violence. And it tells the stories in a way that's so relatable, in the way that if you read the law or if you read a court case, you can be sympathetic. But when you actually see these women's faces and hear their stories and see their tears, it hits you in a way that makes it real. So I think art and media is important. This woman, Mackenzie Lindsay, recently made a song on her ukulele. It's so cute. You should all watch it. It's got like 6.5 million views, and it's this parody about all of the things that women have to do to avoid sexual violence and how we have to accept guys trying to get us to text them nudes and talking about just making a bit of a joke about how some guys are saying it's hard for them right now in the Me Too movement, but also how it's so hard for women. But media and art is a great feminist response to this type of violence and an extraordinary way to get the message out. And finally, just to learn about it, talk about it, and support the people who you listen to. Going to panels, thank you for coming. It's great for you to come and learn. Talking with your friends and colleagues, having awkward family Christmas dinner conversations, posting information on Facebook and going on Twitter. The Me Too movement started because people shared their stories on social media and spoke to each other. And I think there's space for that in the tech-facilitated area. And because tech violence, a lot of people don't take it seriously. They say just turn off your phone, block that person. It's not like you're getting raped. I think to counter that message, when people tell you what they're experiencing, to tell them that you believe them and that you recognize what they're experiencing is a real harm, is a real act, a real feminist act. And so I think that's another, and probably the most important feminist response to tech-facilitated violence. And that's my piece. If you want to get a hold of me, that's my email and my Twitter. I'm happy to chat. I love talking about this issue, and I'll pass it on to Anastasia.
Also, thank you to both of you, and that actually mine fits nicely in at the end, so I'm really happy. So one of the reasons that I think part of the reason that we do this work and that we work so hard to make online spaces safer is that there are actually good sides to the internet, and you both talked about it. The internet and social media, I work on social media, so I'm going to be talking a little bit more specifically about social media, but they have been places for incredible things. Some of the examples that we just saw, they've been places of resistance, they've been places of organizing, they've been places of incredible agency for communities who in the past have not had any or have had very little. And it's a bit of a paradox, of course, because these communities that are now finding a voice, that are able to draw attention to their issues, maybe in ways that they weren't before, are also the ones that are the most targeted. But this paradox is obviously why we need to continue to fight to make sure that online spaces are safe and that they're inequality enhancing and that they are a democratic force, which the internet was supposed to be at the beginning, and unfortunately it's turned into something a little more negative. So when we think about this way of using social media as a way of talking back, as a way of creating our own movements, of drawing attention to issues, of challenging mainstream ideas, white, patriarchal, colonialist ideas, if we step out of the feminist framework for a little bit, that's actually, if we step into the traditional free speech and liberal framework, that is the dream, right? So when we're dealing with angry free speechers, normally the standpoint that they're taking is a liberal free speech idea where the solution, the remedy to bad speech or to hate speech and violent speech is more speech. It's if you use good speech against bad speech because you're right, because you have the truth with a capital T, that will prevail. And the people that are witnessing this debate or this discussion, and I say this with air quotes because it's very often not a debate or a discussion. It's often just vitriol and violence. But the truth is supposed to emerge through this debate and through this conversation, and all will be well. So there's many critiques, obviously. You can tell just in my tone of even that just idea of having a discussion in the world in which we exist, and there are many reasons for which this doesn't work. But if we're talking about just using social media and the internet to talk back, there is another obstacle before even getting to talk back, and that is the guidelines that the platforms have and the way they are extremely unevenly being enforced. So I didn't want to talk about this because I spent a lot of last winter doing conferences and talks where I complained about my feminist activist Instagram being disabled. So Instagram disabled my account. I never got it back. I lost a lot of content, and it was essentially for, vaguely insulting men. But over the weekend, the account that I rebuilt from scratch after this incident got disabled again. So here I am talking about it again and angry again and especially because this second account was a much more moderate, softer version of the previous account. And that just goes to show how much it is an issue for activists and feminists when they get censored, when their accounts get disabled, because we do begin to change the way we speak. I didn't want to go through the process of rebuilding my 100 posts. I wanted them to be there. I wanted them to reach as many people as possible so I can help educate people on issues. So I was using more moderate language. I refrained from #menartrash, and which was the reason my account was disabled the first time. And I'm not an exception. And this is really another example of something that we know is happening and that I think in academia is important to work on, and that's why I want to work on it, because I'm really, really not an exception. Most of the accounts that I followed, activist accounts in all sorts of areas, Indigenous rights, Black Lives Matter, all those groups have been censored wildly. Openly by having their accounts disabled. There's also subtle ways in which the algorithms just don't show the content to their followers. So many accounts are doing, it's really interesting, they're doing their own tests. They'll post something and they'll be like, if you see this picture, can you just like it so I can get an idea of how many of my followers are actually seeing my posts? And for a lot of them, it's about a third. Whereas the more, mainstream accounts, they get all the likes because they show up. And I actually suspect, because when you're on social media a lot the way I am, I can kind of gauge how much likes I'm going to get or reactions from a certain sharing. And I shared the fact that my Instagram account had been disabled on Facebook, and I really think that it didn't show up in a lot of my friends' newsfeed because very few people saw it. I waited a few days, I told my friends about it, friends who are always on social media, they hadn't seen it. So, Facebook and Instagram are the same corporation. So they have different ways of censoring. And it's really problematic because we're being told that we need to talk back and we should just, toughen up and stay out there and stay online. But when we actually do it, we're being censored. So, and this is where I'm going to step back into the feminist framework. So even if we're going to talk back and use more speech, we need to bring a feminist analysis into the solutions and the guidelines and how they're going to be applied and developed. Because the issue here is that, and especially because it's algorithms now that are just cutting content, and to determine what is hate speech and what isn't, what is dangerous and what isn't, you need a feminist analysis. You need that to understand why insulting, racialized women is an issue, and why saying men are scum in the context of, mass denunciations of rape and sexual assault is okay. It's part of resistance. It's an act of resistance. So this is where the feminist analysis in guidelines that are going to be developed if platforms are to be regulated is crucial, because if not, we're just going to have gender-blind rules and regulations that are going to be applied, and they're going to continue to be applied unevenly. That's my point. Thank you.
So I think, sorry. think now it's time like for a Q&A session. So if you have like any question, comment, yes.
Yeah, so I had a question, I guess, for Dillon and
Anastasia?
Anastasia. Okay. Sorry. And just because you mentioned that social media can be used as a positive thing, and we've seen positive things happen with social media, so actually using tech in positive ways to resist violence against women or violence against other minorities. And I've worked on this question a little bit before, the question of the feedback loop, or like how algorithms will keep bringing you content that you like, or content that is tailored to your online participation, and how that can actually create like a safe bubble or a safe space for people to interact online. So obviously, I don't think it's necessarily the right solution, or like an end-all solution, because then you get into issues like isolationism and like, well, you know, you still want to interact with other people outside of your bubble and not just with the same people constantly. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that, on how algorithms or those kinds of technologies can actually help us create safe spaces online for women and other marginalized people.
I think they do, like with groups and stuff like that. I think the algorithms, you're right, can be problematic. And in the reverse case too, you know, like right-wing people that just get fed more and more extreme content, and, you know, explains how they become so radical that you might start off with not, was it you that was telling me, like if whatever, no, it's another colleague, whatever you go to on YouTube, they'll just keep showing you more and more extreme content. So if you start with like cupcake baking, it'll go to like the world's biggest cupcake, and then so whatever you start with is showing you more and more extreme content. So if you start with something that's, you know, center right, you might end up in, you know, Nazi stuff. So algorithms and artificial intelligence, yeah, like feminists have been saying it since the beginning. We have to be careful, and now we're seeing the problems that are coming with it. Coming back to the safe spaces, of course, the problem is sometimes they get targeted. Sometimes they get found. So I think with my second Instagram account, I had like 30 followers. It's this tiny little thing. And I'm sure one men's rights activist found it and got people to report it constantly. So it's hard, you know, and it's unfair because you've created this space, but if someone finds it and finds a way to hack it or, you know, massively report it, then you're left dealing with this opaque box that is Facebook, or trying to complain and get your stuff back. But, you know, it does have the power to do that. You know, obviously, you know, I'm in a bunch of feminist groups and I love it and it's super helpful. But it's just another challenge that the mainstream people don't have to face. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think when it comes to safe space, and Dillon, I'd love to hear more about the algorithm piece, because you probably know more there. But I think when it comes to creating safe spaces, especially if you're from marginalized groups, I know for myself on my Facebook account, I am vicious about who I allow on my space and who I don't. And when there will be certain people who will make a comment, and it'll be one comment that's racist or sexist, and I just cut them from the pile. And that's my space. And that's what I use that space for. I use it as a place of solidarity. I use it as a place to learn from like-minded people. And there's other spaces where I get other information, particularly if you're from a marginalized community. The rest of the world can sometimes feel overwhelming, and you're getting all of that information poured on you. And so to create safe spaces in social media, I don't think we need to apologize about creating spaces where we've made increased filter bubbles. I think what you were speaking about how our content doesn't show up is a problem about having other people join us in those safe spaces, because if they can't find the content, how do they find us? But I don't think anyone should ever apologize about having certain social media filter bubbles that make them feel safe and make them feel good, and you're in a supported community of your people. Those spaces are wonderful.
Yeah, and I mean, I think different people use like different spaces in different ways too, right? Like there's some places that are like more intimate or might feel like safer space. Twitter is usually seen as like a more public platform. So I think people engage in different strategies in different ways. In terms of the algorithms and the data, I think the biggest issue is that oftentimes people really just assume that technology is neutral. So for example, when I was part of the G7 stuff, I was in Montreal at the Innovation and Labor Ministerial, and this group, this AI group from Toronto came up to me, and they really wanted to talk to me, and they're like, oh my God, you're gonna be so excited, we're creating a lawyer robot. And I was like, okay. And they were just so excited because this robot would actually just be such a solution to a lot of the problems around discrimination in law and the ways that lawyers have bias. And then I thought that was really interesting because obviously like that bias and that discrimination and those kind of like attitudes, or even if they're like subconscious, they do get programmed into the technology, right? So, and I think one of the funniest examples I've seen recently of that is that there's this AI group, I don't know if you saw this online, but it was like to do with like machine learning and AI, and what they did is they had this thing and they were testing it, and when they were going on to Reddit threads that were just like generally normal, I guess they were feeding it content from there, but then they decided to try and feed it content from only subreddits on death. And then what they would do is they would show Rorschach ink blots to the AI and to see like what it would say. And when it was fed the normal content, it was like, oh, you know, like butterflies and blue skies and like walking in the park. And then like suddenly the same ink blots to this like subreddit on death AI was like, you know, like, I don't know, like really like graphic things about like people getting murdered or people falling out of windows and people, so it was just going to show that like depending on the content that gets fed to these algorithms or AI, it definitely changes the context of what is happening. So I think the biggest thing though around algorithms and all these pieces is that they're definitely proprietary in the sense that we actually don't know what the heck they do, and I think the people who create them actually also don't know what they do. So I think a big thing for us is like looking at data and like AI in this gender-based lens that Anastasia was talking about through intersectional data, and also just ensuring that the data that we're creating and these algorithms and these corporations are actually being transparent with how these things work. Because I think that's one of the biggest problems that we're facing is that we actually, like with Facebook, like that algorithm is worth so much money, and to try and understand how it works is like really complicated, and we spend so much time just trying to figure out what the heck it does that we can't really figure out what kind of solutions we can create. So it's either we demand transparency and accountability from these platforms, you know, like we're valuable to them. And then I've also seen people messing with the algorithms, right, too, because I think algorithms tend to categorize and class people in certain ways, but it can't for the life like really nuance all the complexities in people's like human relationships, right? So I think it really just makes us into these boxes, which we're like not. So how we can resist that by feeding these algorithms things that, you know, it could just not understand. So I think, you know, not taking that too seriously, I think a lot of people really mess with algorithms and content in that way. And then also just creating our own technology. I think that's also a solution. Yeah.
Yes, I just have two questions. The first one, in the federal government, budget 2017 and budget 2018, they committed to conducting the budget via gender-based analysis. From your experience, did that make a difference? Did we see an increase of funding to the groups that you mentioned? That's number one. Number two, I think it was recently on the CBC or Global Mail, where they were talking about one of the side effects of Me Too, that doctors are afraid to taking on mentoring upcoming female doctors. From you, how would we counter that? And do you think a legislation is a solution, where a quota to ensure that upcoming female doctors have the chance to be mentored? Because, you know, the article said that doctors are afraid that if they take on female doctors, their reputation will be ruined, and you know they're using excuses. In my opinion, they're total BS excuses. But what do you think would be? How do we encounter that? That's the second question.
We're seeing for the first question, we are seeing some increased funding for women's organizations right now. Obviously, I want billions more going into them, particularly into innovation. I know that Canada's invested a lot of money into artificial intelligence, and I don't know where all that money is going, but I hope that some of it is going into a feminist analysis of artificial intelligence. There has been some increased funding in women's organizations, and I think in the next year or so you'll see the impacts of that, of the research that's coming out, and the government has committed to doing gender-based analysis on their legislation, and so hopefully that will make major improvements. So I think I'm hopeful at this stage.
I will say, like, if we're just talking about funding, one of the problems with a lot of government funding right now is that it's project-based. So, like, the Harper government took away core funding for groups. Basically just means you have funding and you do what's important at that moment. So you have to submit a project and get that approved in a lot of the cases. So that's one of, so there is more funding, but it's still project-based, which is a problem for organizations if ever you're advocating. That's one of the things that we need is core funding.
Yeah, and I mean, like, obviously jurisdictional issues, the federal government only has jurisdiction over certain things, so, you know, a lot of the provincial funding goes to, like, frontline services. So since Me Too's happened, I think some of even the local sexual assault centers have seen, like, a 500% increase in demand of service, which is, like, really a lot, and just don't necessarily have the resources to, like, meet that demand. Even just like since this like Kavanaugh stuff has been going on, there's been a lot more people calling like crisis lines and like going to the centers. But yeah, I think the gender-based analysis is really important. I think also looking at like intersectional analysis too, like not just gender, but looking at class, looking at race, ability, that kind of stuff. But there definitely is an improvement, but unfortunately it takes a really long time. And also it's like a cultural change too, right? It's not just like looking at, you know, what the government is doing necessarily, but like just ensuring that like within our own institutions and our cultures and our spaces and our friends, families, like what you're talking about, to try and push for that change is like really important. The second question, that one's a hard one. It's hard because like I've heard a lot of like different folks say like quotas are like really important and like at least like in corporate boards and like looking at, you know, having, you know, gender what is it called? Parity, yeah, gender parity. You know, you saw that in the cabinet with the Trudeau government. Oftentimes, though, within the larger institution, you know, even though you have more women in leadership positions, that they tend to take on certain kind of institutionalized pieces. So you'll see, like, for example, in like police services, women who are in leadership positions will often take on that kind of internalized misogyny. So sometimes they don't necessarily change the culture just by having women. I think it's also by having like really important conversations, having different policies, having legislation. I'm not a lawyer, unlike you folks, but I think all those pieces are kind of needed to ensure that it's like a more holistic approach. For the men who are afraid of mentoring people, well, if you don't sexually assault anyone, I think you'll be fine. Yeah.
So I have the honor of doing research with Suzie. I'm looking a lot at tech-facilitated violence in criminal cases right now, and often the response is judges will deny access to the internet for people that are convicted for these offenses. Do you guys have any opinions about that kind of response?
I mean, I've seen it not be respected a lot. Like they get access anyway, in more subtle ways. But when you're like the person who's living it, you know, like when it's someone who's been stalking you. This is more like just discrete pieces.
Yeah, I mean, like, we've seen a lot of, even in the way, so, like, for example, the 3 women who were murdered in Wilno, which was just outside of Ottawa, like, one of the biggest issues there was that, you know, they knew he was violent, they knew that he had a history, he kept breaching his conditions, and then, you know, even one of the women was wearing, like, a panic button because she knew that he was going to come and kill her, so she went to the police station and said, I need a button so that I could press it, and the police would respond really quickly. And she said, you know, if I do get killed, like, this was the person who killed me. So I think one of the big issues that we're seeing in violence against women on the ground is just that oftentimes these aren't taken seriously. There's a lot of breaches and conditions don't necessarily work. I mean, in the larger conversation about feminism, and this is kind of something that we've been also struggling a lot in the era of Me Too, is just, you know, what do you do when people are hurting other people in your communities? So, like, for example, Optiva, we're having a lot of people come to us saying things like, I just realized I sexually assaulted someone, what do I do? I just realized that I know someone who sexually assaulted someone, what do I do? Should I contact the survivor? Like, there's just like a lot of messy things, and like people don't necessarily want to report to the police, they want to do more community-based responses. There's just not enough, I don't believe, like, ways of intervening in these situations or like having these conversations. So I think that's kind of a larger question. We don't have any like solutions, but I just know that that's kind of something that we're talking about, like that question of accountability and like what does that look like from on the spectrum, like, you know, people maybe they're not necessarily engaging in like sexual assault, but maybe there's like other problematic behaviors that like people want to deal with and they don't know how, right? So
yeah, and I think that the internet prohibition is a really challenging piece, because I think the intentions behind those prohibitions are really good. You know, I think what they're saying is like, we want to take something away from you if you're abusing it. But at the same time, I don't think many people can live lives without the internet at all. Mm-hmm. And so some of the cases where you see 30-year internet bans, when it comes to rehabilitation and when it comes to reintegrating people into our communities, I think internet access is important. I do think that some restrictions, there's been some cases that we've read where they've said you're not allowed to post nude images online anymore, or you're not allowed to post content on sites like The Dirty, or you're not allowed to post content on these really harmful sites. So I think when you have those more specific orders, they're a little bit more meaningful, but then the issue comes back to, are they actually enforced? Are you seeing a police response when people are calling and saying, you know, my images are still being posted up, or this person's still posting content about me on these sites, making statements about me that are untrue, and is there actual enforcement about it? Because again, this is the challenge with the law. We'll have these amazing laws in place, but if they're not enforced, and if people don't feel like these types of protection orders are actually helping them, or that the police or the courts aren't adequately responding to them, then they feel useless. So I think the ones that are put in place need to be meaningful and need to be enforced in a meaningful way. But I do think that full internet bans are a bit too strict, unless you had a severe case of someone who like a repeat offender in very serious offenses like child pornography or something. There might be some extreme circumstance where it might be acceptable, but I can't think of one offhand.
I just feel like 30 years is just a plan to like recriminalize someone, because no one's going to spend 30 years without the internet, so then it's just like, you know, going back, and then what does that lead to? Prison? Like, that's not really an ideal solution.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that you mentioned that you had 2 Instagram accounts disabled, and that makes me so sad, because I'm constantly on Twitter, and you know, you'll see a CBC thread or something that is like mildly progressive, and then you look at the retweets, and it's all these accounts that are fake accounts, or you know, are just like blasting hate on these social media platforms. So you had your Instagram accounts sort of to counteract this, to set something up, set up another space, and I'm just wondering, what are your ideas on some other, you know, counter movements that everyday citizens can do? Should we be like, I've started this new thing exactly like you, someone posts something I don't like on Facebook, I will unfriend them, or like I'm reporting accounts on Twitter. Is that what we should be doing? Do you have any other, you know, ideas how we can be counteracting that?
I think reporting is actually like, because that's data that they'll use, you know. I think that that's useful. If you see something you don't like, report it, so they can start to gather that. Like, I mean, it doesn't work that much because they're very liberal in what they allow. I follow the accounts that you like and give them likes, because I think that one of the reasons that my accounts were disabled so swiftly is because I don't have a lot of followers. Like, it's like a double-edged sword. So I'm not, you know, I don't show up in news feeds or explore a lot, but there are accounts that post more radical content than what I did, but because they, you know, have thousands of followers, I think they hesitate a little bit more, and there tends to be backlash when they get deleted. So the line they have to cross to get deleted is more. So yeah, just follow, support your accounts, support the movements. When they get deleted, you know, write to Instagram, write to Facebook.
Dylan, do you remember the name? There's a great website that if you're experiencing online harassment, you can write to them and you can say, I want support.
Yeah, Heart Mob.
Heart Mob, that's what it is. Yeah, so Heart Mob is this amazing website. So if anyone's experiencing some sort of tech facilitated violence, they can write an email to this organization, and you can be a part of that organization, and they'll send you an email, and it'll just say like, somebody wants you to report these things that are happening to them, or to document them, because often when someone's getting a lot of really upsetting content, it's so emotional just to look at it, and so you can ask other people to document it for you. And so someone who's not experiencing tech violence, you can be the person who can do that labor for them. And also just like sending love and sending shout outs. There's a lot of people who are public online about tech facilitated violence and feminism and gendered issues and intersectional issues altogether that get a lot of internet hate. And so just sending them a message and saying, I love the work that you do, I support you, so that they know that in this sea of trolls, there's friends. You know, I think that can be a really powerful movement.
Yeah, HeartMob also has some like information on how to be an online active bystander. So when you see hate or whatever, you can just intervene by like trying to de-escalate or whatever. So that's also useful. Yeah, HeartMob's pretty cool.
Yeah, but definitely hold the platforms accountable.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No,
They
yeah.
they seem really like, hey, we're just, like when I talk to the Facebook people, like Kevin from Facebook, they're so sweet. Kevin,
Yeah.
he's really sweet, but he's like, no, like Facebook is just a place where people can talk and be friends. I'm like, no, come on, Kevin, be real. It's for friends. I was like, no, there's shit going down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you for your presentations. I found it really interesting and engaging. I guess my question is just kind of for your comments on. So we're discussing feminism. I studied feminism. I'm very familiar with it, but I also am very familiar with the reality that feminists don't see things all the same way, and so even kind of saying adopting a feminist lens to look at something, my feminist lens might be different from someone else's feminist lens, or even we might have the same lens but different priorities within that. And so I guess my concern would be that first of all, like what do we define as kind of content that should be prioritized, content that should be opposed? I think that will differ depending on groups. I know, for example, interesting you talk about groups being shut down. There's been kind of like an upsurge of anti-abortion activists saying that their accounts are being shut down as well. So so they're kind of saying we're experiencing oppression against women, and so I mean, regardless of whether that's true, if you adopt a feminist lens, they're women who are speaking out. Should we be promoting their work even though we disagree with their mentality? There was a big debate in a lot of my feminist classes in my undergrad. So I guess what do we do when adopting a feminist lens just isn't enough? Because I've experienced kind of exclusion from spaces despite being a feminist, because I didn't kind of meet the expectations or match the definition of whatever feminist lens had been adopted. And so, I mean, there's one thing about perpetuating hate, but what happens when you're trying to access a space, but you just have a different understanding of what that looks like, or what should be discussed? And so I don't know, I don't have an exact question, but maybe just comment on that, because I think I love the idea of adopting a feminist lens, but I feel like it's so much more complicated, so you guys are the professionals.
There's no perfect feminist out there. I think that's the biggest thing too. I think with feminism you have to be careful about falling into the trap of white girl feminism, that's exclusionary, that isn't intersectional, that doesn't prioritize the needs of all women. But like all movements, all ways of being, all ways of thinking, there's going to be diversity in it. I think there's a wide spectrum of people who identify themselves as feminist, and you need to work to find that space. And then if you are in a position of power, like I know that we are in a position of power, ensuring that you're making space for those voices that are not typically heard, I think is very important. Like groups that are excluding particular people, why are they excluding those people? Can we find ways to create space for them? But I'm not ready to abandon feminism yet. I think it's a lens that definitely works for my research and needs a lot of improvement. But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, feminism is messy. Doing any kind of community-based work is really messy. There's a lot of lateral violence. Oftentimes it's much easier to critique the folks who are in your community than actually critique the systems, right? Because it's not really necessarily a tangible thing. But like, for example, I work in violence against women and I identify as non-binary. So it's been really interesting for me to be like one of the first people to be like doing violence against women work. And we've been really pushing for, having a more gender inclusive lens. So not necessarily taking away from women and what women have done, but looking at how violence affects people of different genders in different ways, right? So even though I identify as non-binary, it doesn't mean that I haven't experienced misogyny, that I haven't experienced violence. So for us, it's really kind of trying to figure that out. Not to say that I haven't had any backlash. I've definitely had a lot of backlash. I've been in meetings where, older feminists have told me that, they didn't want to adopt more inclusive language, that they felt like, not using the word specifically women would be really dangerous and problematic. I would combat that with saying, you know, like, what do you mean by women? Because oftentimes what they're talking about is like white, middle class, you know, cis, able-bodied women, versus me, I'm thinking about trans people, and I'm thinking about indigenous people, sex workers. The sex worker thing is just like a huge controversial issue within the feminist movement. So for me, I like Susie's saying, you know, whose voices are generally not at the table, who's not represented, how can I support them better? And then also just forcing feminism to be a bit more accountable too. Like, I think it's messy, it's imperfect. I think it's still really useful, but I also think that we have a lot of work to do, and I think it is an intergenerational thing too. Like, I think, you know, we've all been kind of facing different issues, and we're kind of coming up at a different era in conversations, and I think if we all work together and collaborate, even like men within the feminist movement, you know, how do you have that conversation? At Ottawa, we have an engaging men's program, so I work with men a lot. So I think everybody has a role to play. It's just trying to figure out what that looks like and how can we work together if we can. And if you know, you really don't agree, then that's okay. Like, I have a really hard time being engaged with people who like aren't necessarily pro-sex work, or, you know, might be really trans exclusionary. That's really, really difficult, particularly because it speaks like really personally to me. But at the same time, by not engaging with those people, I think it's also a problem too. So, you know, and I used to be very much like, I really don't like the police. I really don't want to invest in like carceral kind of stuff. But here I am working with the police a lot of the time because I realize they're not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I like what they all said, but just to add like on that last point exactly, is like, you know, there's what we do in our work, in our academic work, where we can be very much like, you know, the police are the worst and let's abolish prisons, and like there's being strategic when you're talking to, when you're on the ground, when you're dealing with the real situation, when you're trying to change policy, what's exactly realistic is a good way. But me neither. I think feminism and intersectional feminism is still a very relevant lens to do work with.
So thank you very much. I'm sorry, but we need to wrap up. So please join me to thank again our amazing panelists.